Thank you, Steve. I'm really happy to be here amongst a group of people with interest in Korea. New York's fun. I haven't been here for quite a while. So that's the silver lining to coming here. But I'm also here to promote this book, Reassessing the Park Chung-hee Era. This is an edited volume. It has, I don't know, about 10 essays by a variety of authors with a variety of points of view. But before I get into the book, I wanted to thank Steve Naper for bringing me here. I want to give thanks to the Korea Society for having this program for me. And I want to remember the program that they did for us last November when Steve and Nikita Desai brought to the Seattle campus Ambassador Hubbard, Ambassador Minton, Bob Carlin, and so forth to present on the North Korean issue. And this was actually a return trip that we had had a dialogue with the Korea Society starting in the winter of 2011 when I organized a task force, which is a capstone course for our international studies students called Rethinking U.S. Policy Toward North Korea, in which the students organized themselves to write a book-length policy paper, and then we ask an outside reader to assess it. And Ambassador Hubbard was very kind and agreed to do that. And so that kind of started our relationship with the Korea Society, and it's something that I hope we can continue. The special performance called Pook and Blues with the Pak Bong-gu trio was done in the evening. It was a hit. It's kind of fusion electronic, kum traditional Korean music. It was quite appropriate for Seattle. Steve Pak said he was really inspired by the grunge movement in Seattle and was really glad to be there. So we videotaped his performance and we posted it to the Center for Korea Studies Facebook page. So if you want to see what fusion Pook and blues can be, you can go on to the University of Washington Center of Korea Studies Facebook page and you can click on the video of that very interesting performance. Okay, now to talk about the book itself. Reassessing the Park Chung-hee era, 1961 to 1979. I was shocked when the book came out and we got a cover and somebody looked at it and they said, well, which one is Park Chung-hee? And it never occurred to me that anybody wouldn't recognize which one is Park Chung-hee. So just for the record, this is Park Chung-hee. Right? So, you know, you learn something new every time. So that was one thing that I learned. This book had its origin in a conference that was organized by Hyung-a Kim at the University of Wollongong in Australia in 2004. Hyung-a now teaches at Australian National University in Canberra. She's a professor of Korean studies there now. But at the time she was at Wollongong, which is a wonderful beach resort about 40 minutes south of Sydney. It was a wonderful conference. It was sponsored by POSCO, BHP, Rio Tinto, and the Australian Korea Foundation. And the notable thing about this conference is that Hyung-a had deliberately included the whole range of people who dealt with the Park Chung-hee period. So one of the keynote speakers was Oh Won-chul. Some of you may not recognize that name. Oh Won-chul was the engineer in the Blue House who was planning the heavy and chemical industrialization during the 1970s. He had a colleague whose name slips my mind right now. So Oh Won-chul was the engineer, and he was to say, you know, you need a steel industry, and if you have a steel industry, then you can have a shipbuilding industry, and if you have chemical industry, then you can make fertilizer for the farm people and so forth. He was making those plans in the Blue House. The heavy and chemical industrialization was not done through the Economic Planning Bureau, surprisingly enough. So Oh Won-chul was there. An engineer who just was a just the facts kind of guy. I worked for Pak, and I gave him the facts, and Pak did what he wanted to do. But we also had Peng-nak Chung, who's the editor of Chung Hee, or Creation and Criticism, which is a literary magazine that has been quite critical of authoritarian politics, and Pak in particular. So Peng-nak Chung was there as well, and he wrote an essay, How to Understand the Pak period. So we had a range of people. We also had the late Jim Palais, who was a historian at the University of Washington. It's probably his last publication before he died, in which he was known as kind of a left-wing curmudgeon, but he actually had a fairly optimistic view of the development of democracy in Korea through and after the Pak Chung-hee regime. Now, unfortunately, we were not able to publish Oh Won-cheol's essay. When we sent out the permission to publish letters, Mr. O was quite ill, so it went to his publisher, and the publisher sent us a letter back saying, we own the right to all of his publications, and no, you can't publish it. So that essay is missing, which we regret, but all the other essays from the conference are in there. Now, at the time of the conference, which was in 2004, there was a strong strain of nostalgia for Pak in South Korea as people became disillusioned by the post-IMF Korean economy. And many of you know, in 1997, 1998, South Korea had a currency crisis. They had to have a bailout by the IMF. Koreans call it the IMF era. Some people object to that name, saying, you know, it was really Korea's currency crisis, and IMF saved them. They're not the cause of this. But whatever, Koreans think of it as the IMF era. And the Korean economy since 1997 is utterly different from the economy we had before 1997. It's much more internationalized. It has foreign ownership of companies, which was not possible before 1997, all kinds of imported goods. You see all sorts of expatriates working in South Korea today, which is not something you would have seen before 1997. So 1997 was a turning point, and South Koreans very often feel that life has gotten harder since 1997. There are not enough jobs, not enough good jobs for all the people that are qualified for them. And there's kind of anxiety about one's position in society. And in that context, there was nostalgia for the Pak era, where it seemed like everybody was going up together. This wasn't limited only to South Korea, but in fact, there was a kind of authoritarian nostalgia throughout a lot of the third world in 2004. And that was one of the impetuses for having this conference. We thought it was a really opportune time to get people who agreed with the Pak administration and people who had criticized the Pak administration as well to come together, talk to each other, give their papers, and see what came of it. And what came of it is this book and the 10 essays in the book, some of which I'll summarize in a minute. Before I summarize, I wanted to mention the book is available in paperback. It's available in hardback by special order. Those of you that teach at universities, if a university library buys the hardback version, they will also get an electronic copy for their library, so that if you want to use electronic reserves in your courses, that's possible. Excuse me. We don't have a Kindle edition yet. If there's demand for a Kindle edition, it costs only about $500 to have a Kindle edition processed. So if some of you wish there was a Kindle edition available and think there's demand for it, please let me know, because we can arrange for it if that's what's going on. Okay, so that's kind of the hard sell. Now we'll go to the contents of the book. So we thought in 2004 it was a good time to look at the PAC regime in its entirety and kind of see what the questions are. Now I'm going to do a short little historical lecture for you for a minute, just to remind you of some of the characteristics of the PAC regime. First of all, the PAC regime comes in three flavors, okay? Because President PAC at times was authoritarian, at times was democratic. It wasn't uniform throughout the period from 1961 to 1979 when he was assassinated. So the first period was the 1961 to 1963 period. After the coup, which was led by Pak and his cronies in the South Korean military, and they ruled for 18 months as a military junta called the Supreme Council for National Reconstruction, sometimes abbreviated SCNR. So it was a military junta at first. At that time, they dissolved the National Assembly. They had military tribunals to try people whom they thought had been corrupt. Pak's son-in-law, Kim Jong-pil, organized the KCIA, which still has a descendant in South Korea today. The Economic Planning Bureau was organized, and the Economic Planning Bureau put forth the first 5-year plan, and South Korea had 5-year plans every 5 years for the next 30 to 40 years. So all of this was an innovation in the first 18 months of the Supreme Council for National Reconstruction. Now, in those days, the United States provided almost half of the South Korean budget. And the United States was very anxious that South Korea, which is a frontline state, a demonstration state of the superiority of democracy and capitalism, and facing North Korea. So we were very anxious that South Korea return to democracy, and we put a lot of pressure on Park to do this. And he initially did this. So in 1963, he took off his uniform, ran for president as a civilian, and won the presidency. So the period from 1963 to 1967 is usually called the Third Republic. So the First Republic was Syngman Rhee, Second Republic was Changmyeon, that lasted for about 8 months, and then you have the military junta, and then the Third Republic was when Pak ran for president as a civilian. So the Third Republic was more or less democratic. It wasn't perfect, but it was more or less democratic, and this was a period when rapid industrialization really took off based on light industry. The problem, as I analyze it, is that there was a political contradiction that was introduced during this time. Because the rapid industrialization induced rapid urbanization as well. But as South Korean society urbanized, the urban populations did not support PAC to the same degree that the rural populations did. So as the rural population fell and the urban population went up, there was a political problem that PAC was having a harder and harder time winning elections. So it was kind of the political contradiction of successful economic growth. I talk about that in my essay about rural Korea, which I'll say a couple of things about later on. So finally, in 1972, just after almost losing an election to Kim Dae-jung, some people say he actually did lose the election to Kim Dae-jung. I don't know whether that's true or not, but depending upon who you talk to. But anyway, it was a close call. And this was at a time when the U.S. was withdrawing from Vietnam. President Nixon was saying that Asian nations have to take more responsibility for their own defense and so forth. So General Pak, or President Pak at this time, because we were still in the Third Republic, declared a state of emergency in December of 1972. he dissolved the National Assembly again, declared martial law, and created a new constitution, the so-called Yushin Constitution. Yushin means renewal. It's the same term as the Japanese word Ishin, which is usually translated as Meiji Restoration. Uh, Actually, Meiji Restoration is a mistranslation. Ishin means renewal. So the Japanese called the Meiji Restoration the Meiji Renewal. And so Pak was clearly inspired by that, and he called it the Yushin Constitution. Now, the Yushin Constitution called for indirect election of the president by National Council for Unification. The National Assembly was elected from multi-seat constituencies, and 1/3 of the National Assembly was directly appointed by the president under the Yushin Constitution. So this was a rather authoritarian period, but this was also the period when the heavy and chemical industrialization was pushed through. This was done directly from the Blue House, which is the presidential mansion, rather than through the Economic Planning Bureau. And this is what created the iron and steel industries, the shipbuilding industry, petrochemicals, machine tools, non-ferrous metals, and there's always one I forget, electronics or something. There were 6 main industries they created that are the basis of South Korea's industrial economy today. How did they do it? Well, luckily, there were the oil shocks of the 70s. And one of the silver linings of the oil shocks of the 70s is that the Arab countries were putting huge amounts of money into New York banks. The New York banks were looking for some place to lend that money. And South Korea said, we'll take it. We'll use sovereign debt to borrow this money, and they put it in state-owned banks, and the state-owned banks divvied it out to those tebel who would be willing to create the industries that were compatible with the plan under Pak. Okay, so that's your little lesson in history. Now, Pak was assassinated in 1979 amidst a recession that was brought about by the second oil shock. There were labor riots in Masan in Busan, down on the southeast coast. Kim Young-sam, who later became president, had been arrested because he was demanding democracy and so forth. So there were a lot of things that were happening at that time. Depending upon your political point of view, people said, you know, because Pak was assassinated, maybe some lives were saved, because some people thought that the demonstrators would have been shot if he had lived. I don't know if that's true or not. The subsequent history of South Korea was that Chun Doo-hwan took over, and there was a Gwangju uprising, and a lot of people did die in Gwangju, though, rather than Masan and Busan. That's not about our book. That's just kind of a sequel. But there are some legacy issues that people need to talk about. In the IMF crisis, for the first time, this was in 1997, which is 20 years after Pak, but the economic policies of the Yushin regime continued through Chun Doo-hwan, and it wasn't really until democratization in 1987 that, say, consumer economy started growing, that wages started rising, and other things like that kind of transformed the economy of the Yushin period took place. And then 10 years later, the IMF currency crisis took place, and people started calling South Korea an example of crony capitalism. South Korea had never been called crony capitalist before. That was for the Philippines. That was for President Marcos. That was not for a successful industrializer. So that was one of the impetuses for people thinking about these kinds of issues. Is authoritarian nostalgia appropriate, or is this really just crony capitalism that was destined to fail in the long run anyway because it was unbalanced? So there are a variety of views about the Pak regime. Some people thought and still think that Pak was a great president who created South Korea's industrial economy and advanced the modernization of the South Korean economy. Hardly anybody denies that outright. It would be pretty difficult to do that. But some people think that the way in which he advanced the economy had a hidden deleterious effects that harmed the development of the economy later on. One of the essays in here is by Myung-gu Park, professor of political science at Seoul National University, who calls the Pak regime a regime of compressed modernization, 압축적인 근대화. And he's saying that this created an overdependence on cheap labor and authoritarian methods, which retarded balanced development, made the producers more important than the consumers. Consumption was underdeveloped and created an unbalanced economy that eventually led to the IMF crisis. Even today, there are both what are called new right and new left commentators in South Korea. The new left commentators talk about the chaebol, I'll have to explain what chaebol means. Usually in English, when we say chaebol, we're thinking of the large conglomerate companies like Hyundai, Samsung, and so forth. And that is one of the meanings of chaebol. When Koreans use the term chaebol, that's the second definition. The first definition that comes to mind when you say chaebol is the families that own these very large conglomerates. So I'm using the term chaebol in that first sense in this case. So the new left say the chaebol, that is these moneyed families that own these companies, relied on special privileges, personal relationships with the president and the center to get their capital, that they ate up capital that more rationally might have gone to smaller scale producers. And so they gobbled up all the capital in the economy. They also gobbled up small scale rivals who might have made a more resilient, more robust economy than the one that was created. So that's one of the criticisms one sometimes hear of the Pak economy. There are other people. There's a new right as well. A lot of young people are new right as well, who point to other factors. They say that, first of all, South Korea, you have to remember, was a frontline state in the confrontation with communism. So you couldn't just randomly do neoclassical economics in South Korea, because South Korea directly confronted North Korea and had a very significant security problem that they had to create heavy industry in order to preserve themselves. And in the question and answer session, we can talk about this. I think there's a lot of evidence that the North Koreans were terrified of Pak Chung Hee, that after he took over in South Korea, the North Koreans started putting huge amounts of their economy into defense industry starting in 1962. I think that data is not accidental. Well, so as soon as North Korea started doing that, South Korea had to do a response. And so an arms buildup was a response of this, because South Korea was a frontline state. So people in the new right say you have to think about this process of being a frontline state. And in particular, and I'll have to look at my table of contents, Kim Young-jak has pretty much supports Pak's point of view, and he says two things: that under the conditions of a frontline state, Pak and people like him had to create a hierarchy of goals. You couldn't achieve all goals at the same time. You had to say, this goal is more important than this goal, and this goal is more important than that one. And Pak himself used to talk about the big freedoms and the little freedoms. And for Pak, the big freedom is the freedom of South Korea to go on and not be taken over by North Korea. So the big freedom was existence as a self-governing capitalist state. The things that we usually think of freedoms, like civil rights, freedom of the press, all of those, Pak calls them little freedoms. That sure, they're freedoms that you want, but in the hierarchy of goals at that time, the big freedom has to come before the little freedom. Uh, and as somebody who lived in South Korea in the 1970s, I can attest to the fact that that kind of goal setting was widely accepted as legitimate amongst the Korean population. There were plenty of people who rejected it, but I would guess that the majority of the population accepted that, democracy is a great system, but under those conditions, South Korea had to set goals, and that Park got it right. The late Jim Palais had a really interesting take on this. Now, many of you may not be familiar with his work. He's actually a pre-modern historian. He writes mostly on 19th century Korea, but he was also politically engaged, and he wrote on human rights and democracy as well. And so he wrote an essay for this volume, and normally he was on the left of the political spectrum, but the essay that he wrote was actually quite unexpected. And it's his last really essay on these issues before he died. And he was quite philosophical about the whole process. And he said, Korea eventually did become democratic. And the reason Korea became democratic was because the people themselves actually struggled for democracy. And there was a dialectic between development and the struggle for democracy, and that dialectic was actually necessary for the establishment of democracy in South Korea. And if you compare, say, South Korean democracy, which is pretty lively, with Japanese democracy, which in my view is less lively, there seems some truth to it, that there's really a grassroots feeling about democracy in South Korea, the citizens' movements, the NGOs, and all of that. It really goes deep into the population. And to me, it seems to come from the fact that democracy was not handed to South Koreans on a silver platter, although the US would have liked to have done that, but it didn't work out that way. But they really had to struggle for democracy, and so they value the democracy that they have. Okay, so that's kind of the big picture. I wanted to spend just a couple minutes talking about my particular take on this. And my particular take, since I'm an anthropologist who did field work in rural Korea in the 70s and 80s, is I wanted to remind readers of the importance of the rural sector. Because I think, people, when they think about the Pak period, they think, oh gosh, industrialization, heavy in chemicals, shipbuilding, Hyundai, and all of that. And they forget that, in fact, during this period, the rural sector was still the largest and politically most important sector in South Korea. South Korea did not become predominantly urban, let's say 50% plus urban, until around 1975, which is almost the end of the Pak era. So that the rural sector was both economically and politically important during that area in ways that it's not today. Today, maybe less than 4% of the GDP of South Korea is produced in the rural sector, and less than probably 12% of the population are active in the rural sector anymore. So the rural sector is not significant. But that doesn't mean it wasn't significant in the 60s and the 70s. So I wanted to read just a little section that gives you my point of view. Collective memories of the Pak regime are popular today in certain sectors of Korean society, but these memories tend to be anachronistic and teleological. They're teleological, of course, because they interpret the past in terms of its purpose in creating the present rather than the way it was. These memories are anachronistic because they neither correspond to the consciousness of Pak and his associates during the 60s and 70s when they were active, nor to the consciousness of Koreans during those times. The basic problem is that those collective memories generally ignore the rural sector and the importance of the rural sector in the thinking of Park and the economic and social planners of the times. Why was the rural sector so important at that time? It was important for three reasons. First of all, it absorbed the largest amount of Korean labor well until the end of the 70s. So, you had a problem of unemployment, all these people that were not being productively used. Excuse me. Eventually, they were moved from unproductive rural jobs to productive urban jobs. But that took a process of 20 to 30 years to be completed. And you have a political process that's going on while that took place. So the ability of the rural sector to absorb surplus labor that the urban sector was not able to absorb yet was very important to Pak. He thought about it a lot. Second, he needed to produce a modicum of prosperity in the rural as well as in the urban sector. Okay, since the majority of the population until 1975 were living in rural areas, if he wanted to have a successful economy that provided him the political support that he needed, he had to provide at least a degree of prosperity to the rural sector. And if you look at the policies during that time, rural development was very, very important to them. And finally, the rural sector was the most critical sector for Pak's political support. In fact, my view is that the Yushin Constitution and the abrogation of the democracy of the Third Republic was probably the political consequence of the decline of the rural sector. Thank you. Why? Because as Korea urbanized, the urban population, whom you would think would have been pro-Pak because he created the jobs that had brought them to the urban sector in the first place. But in fact, his popularity in urban areas declined very precipitously. And by the late 60s, he could not win over any of the urban cities. So initially in 1963, when he ran the presidency, he took all the cities. He took Seoul, Busan, and so forth. By the late 60s, the Democratic Justice Party, which was Pak's party, lost all of the cities, was not able to take any of them, and only the rural vote kept him in power. So when he almost lost an election, or did lose an election in 1971, it was because the rural vote was no longer big enough to keep him in power. So in my view, the Yushin Constitution was a consequence of the decline of the rural sector. We see in 1971, as the Yushin movement got underway, that the HCI, the heavy and chemical industrialization movement, was part one leg of the new industrialization policy. But we forget that the second leg of their development policy was the new village movement that started in 1971 as well. President Pak was deeply involved in both of these movements. He met weekly on the new village movement as well as with the heavy and chemical industrialization movement. And I thought I'd read you one more quote here. If I can find it. Yeah, this quote is a 1979 publication, which just happened to be the month that Pak was assassinated, of Park's speeches that had been translated in English. But I want to read you part of the English language introduction to just illustrate how important these New Village movement programs were to the political legitimacy of the Pak regime. So here I'm quoting the preface. The Semaul, or New Community Movement, which President Park Chung-hee personally initiated and has led, is spreading rapidly throughout our land. It is a spiritual revolution which has achieved the immense task of modernizing the rural community in Korea and is the chief driving force behind the bold bid to accomplish national regeneration for Korea. Now, isn't that interesting? Park, we remember for his industrialization, and yet in this publication of 1979, it's all about rural revitalization. So I wrote my essay just to remind us that the rural sector was so important to them. In my view, the New Village movement was not as successful as the propaganda put it out to be. And it's not necessarily because I think rural development didn't take place, but rather that there were other mechanisms by which rural development took place that, in my view, are more important than the New Village movement, even though for political purposes, the New Village movement was the most important. So, they always cite all of the grass roofs that were replaced with corrugated iron. And in my view, all that did was put the peasants in debt because they had to buy the corrugated iron from the corrugated iron chebble, and they had to borrow money to do that. And many of the other programs put the peasantry into debt. And by the time that Pak was assassinated in 1979, rural indebtedness was a very, very serious problem that hasn't got a lot of publicity. But I wanted to mention that there were actually 4 ministries that dealt with rural development, and the New Village movement was one of them. But there was also an agency for rural revitalization, Nongton Jenungtung. There was an agricultural co-op, which, despite its name, was a centralized government ministry. So Nongop Hyopdongjohap, and which provided seed, fertilizer, marketed certain kinds of crops for people, and in my view was the most direct. It provided the crop supports as well, and in my view, this was the most direct beneficiary of the rural society. And there was also the Agricultural Guidance Office that is like the rural extensions we have in U.S. states as well, that was providing modernized seeds, modernized fertilizer, technical know-how, and so forth, and research for them. So the Agricultural Co-op and the Agricultural Guidance Office were more important, in my view, than the New Village movement, even though in terms of propaganda, the New Village movement got more credit. Now, when I looked at this historically, you can trace a lot of these rural development programs right back to the colonial period. So they weren't necessarily invented by Pak himself. Now, my view of this is not that these programs were invented by Japanese, and is not that they were borrowed from Japan, but rather they were programs made in Korea during the colonial period that were then brought back to Japan and sent to Japan. And, I give evidence for that in my paper, that 2 of the governor generals of Korea in the 1930s later became prime ministers of Japan, and the rural development programs that were prevalent in Korea that were created by Korean intellectuals in tandem with the Japanese authorities. So there's Korean input into these programs, were then exported back to Japan. So actually the movement is from Korea to Japan rather than Japan and Korea. And we find a lot of the themes from this movement in the 1930s, not only in South Korea, but also in Japan, but lagged by 5 years in Japan from Korea. We also find them in North Korea. There's a phrase that many of you, if you're Korean, will be familiar with, "자력 갱생," that is pulling us up by our own bootstraps or by our own efforts. It's no coincidence that this was, in fact, one of the main slogans of the Talima movement in the late 50s and early 60s in North Korea. It comes from the same source in North Korea that it comes from in South Korea, and that it comes from in Japan. So that's kind of interesting. There are deep historical roots to these developments. They've spread out from South Korea, and the New Village movement was really only the tip of the iceberg, and in my view, not the most important element of rural reconstruction. The main thing were the crop price supports, which in the 1970s were enough so that rural standards of living were only about 20% below urban standards of living in the late 1970s. The problem with this is it could not be sustained, not so much because Korea didn't want to keep it up, but because of the Uruguay and Doha rounds of the GATT. the General Agreement on Trades and Tariffs, which is now the World Trade Organization. So I'll leave that there. There was some success, but the rural sector was a very important part of the PAC regime. It was critical politically. It was important economically as well. So we can talk about that. We can talk about any of the other essays, provided I remember what other people wrote, or any other issues that come to mind. So I'm happy to take questions, answers.
Thank you. Thank you, Claude. That was wonderful. If I could maybe start with the first question, and that's,
Yeah, let me walk in front of the light so that I can.
Yeah, it's very hot under those blue lights.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. The first question I have is one on nostalgia, because there is a nostalgia around Park. Perhaps some of it's related to the nostalgia for the rural era, and also how you see that linked to the person of Park Geun-hye and the implications for this year. I know it's a big question, but I thought we'd lead with that.
To contemporary politics. I was afraid you'd ask that. I don't know if I want to get lynched.
Actually, maybe we can have you.
We're live web streaming right now, so I think if you wouldn't mind.
Okay.
Yeah.
There is contemporary relevance. It's hard to know how it played out. You know, in 2004, Roh Moo-hyun was still president of South Korea, and the election of Imanbak in, when was it, 2007, certainly was a reflection of this nostalgia for the Park era, if not Park himself. You know, people felt so abused by the IMF and all of that, and in globalization and whatnot, that they really thought, gosh, if we could only go back to the period when everything was going great, everybody was going up together, and maybe Imanbak can do that. I think the nostalgia is not as strong today, because what history has proven is there can't really be a Park Chung-hee in the 21st century. The global economy is completely different, that South Korea has too complex an economy now to just kind of roar ahead with newly made industries. People wanted Lee Myung-bak to be that person, and he tried, but I don't think he really succeeded. And I'm not saying he's a bad president, but just that aspect of his presidency has proven impossible to revive. Park Geun-hye, I kind of like her. As a person, I think she has a kind of sincerity. One thing about her is that she doesn't seem to be as corrupt as some of the old politicians are in South Korea. But there are a lot of people that have a, you know, gut reaction to anybody from that period going ahead. And having a Korean female president would be a really big step for South Korea. So I think she's an interesting figure. My guess is she probably won't become president.
It's good to see you again after all these years, Clark. This is Homer Williams, and I thought you gave a very good summary of the book. I have some residual questions, however. One of the most important aspects of the early PAC era was the normalization of relations with Japan, and this was an extremely significant event and important, if nothing else, for a source of technology that was very, very clear in early Korean industrialization. The other aspect that, again, this is quasi-foreign policy, is the competition. It wasn't just that North and South Korea were facing each other with huge armies. It was also that there was competition between the two, with South Korea at a disadvantage until the 70s, when they actually surpassed North Korea in GDP per capita. And I'm wondering if you could talk about that competition and also the fact that Pak actually made one of the first um, real achievements in North-South negotiations with the Red Cross talks. I'll leave it there.
Those are a couple of pretty interesting questions. As for the normalization with Japan in 1965, I think your analysis is pretty correct, that it was essential. It was very difficult to put through, and he spent some political capital to get that normalization. Of course, he got some real capital as a result as well. I suppose the dissatisfaction that people had with that, apart from the emotional reaction, which, you know, kind of passed, was that they weren't able to do much at that time for the Korean residents of Japan. And they kind of thought getting this capital and technology is, you know, in the hierarchy of our goals. These are the main goals, and we can't sacrifice those goals in order to get permanent residence or citizenship or something for the ethnic Korean residents of Japan. So, but I think otherwise you're right, it was critical. On the second issue, it's slipping my mind now. Oh, yeah. Competition between North and South. I suppose my view of that is a little different than yours. The kind of received wisdom is that the North Korean economy was doing better than the South Korean economy until the mid to late 70s. In my view, that's probably erroneous. I don't think that the North Korean economy was doing nearly as well as people say it was. After all, I'm teaching a course on North Korea right now, and as you go through the materials, you know, first of all of the communist countries that fell and for which we've been able to see their books, the economy was in much worse shape than anybody had imagined. So probably that would have been true of North Korea. But the second thing is North Korea stopped publishing statistics in 1963. And if North Korea was actually that much better than South Korea, I don't think they would have stopped publishing statistics in 1963. Since 1963, all you've gotten is percentages. You know, we did 10% more this year. You don't know what the base is. I think, you know, anthropological studies of stature that have been done over time really show that there were no improvements in nutrition in North Korea until the 70s and 80s. And that indicates to me that the standard of living in North Korea was actually quite low right through the 60s and 70s. You know, maybe they were producing a lot of pig iron, but as we all know, in communist economies, you can produce a lot of stuff. That doesn't mean they produce stuff that was necessarily useful. So my particular view is, yes, they were competing. It was an important issue for them. People thought maybe that North Korea was doing better than South Korea. In hindsight, I think probably they weren't.
Yeah. If I could make a couple of comments, I think your talk was very good and very much on point. I have to confess that my wife and I lived in South Korea in the 70s, and my wife continuously accused me of being a running dog of the regime. And my answer to that, I was the manager of Citibank, was that it was necessary to put bread on the table in order to be positive to the government. I would make 3 points, and I think to some extent you have covered this, but it's important. One is what I would call the moral and intellectual presence of Japan in President Pak, number one, who, as I understood, got most of his foreign information from Japan, and of course his education and so on. And the country was very oriented to that, and it seemed to me that catching up to Japan, Korea assuming its proper place, which was certainly not below Japan, in a sense out-Japanning Japan, was a very important element. Number two, and I think you mentioned Mr. O and so on, I think both the strength and the weakness of the president's economic management was its concentration on engineering and physical aspects as opposed to finance and supply and demand and the economy. I will say that it was one reason why, on balance, it was quite easy to raise a lot of money for Korea in the 70s because one could always see it being put to work, and we would make a loan, large loans, for example, to POSCO, and 15 to 18 months later, we could go and see what they actually did with it. And I think that was greatly strengthening. The final point I'd want to make is a kind of Marxist one, in the sense that I felt that the president basically dug the grave of his political system by building up the economy. It was very evident, certainly when we were there, that South Koreans, or Koreans if we want to speak generally, were people who wanted to have their say, who knew what they were doing. I sometimes said to the finance minister, I didn't deal with the president himself, that it was necessary to trust the people. And the result of all this economic development was, in a communist sense, dialectical sense, it became, in my opinion, inevitable that Korea would become democratic as the economy grew and as they got over the economic management problems of an undue concentration on physical development and a little more attention to supply and demand and basically financial factors.
Well, there are quite a few points. I don't know if I can comment on all of them. If I probably can't even remember all of them, but certainly at that time, the feeling that economic development is first, feeding people is first, and democracy, however desirable, is something that we have to put out, was widespread, particularly amongst economic elites, but not just economic elites. The lack of democracy was most keenly felt amongst the students who fought for it and amongst certain liberal Christians. But of course, 80% of South Korea's Christians are conservative rather than liberal. So those were smaller movements. And when I read Peng Nak-chung's essay, in spite of the fact that I was sympathetic to the Democrats at the time, his view was that, Park's approach was a beggar's approach. And, the slogan was, 우리도 잘 살아보자. Let's try to live well too. And, his idea that focusing on material things was kind of a beggar's philosophy. But of course, he came from a fabulously wealthy family. He had prep school education in the United States. And, why did he have to worry about eating? So I'm not actually very sympathetic. And those are the kind of intellectuals that Pak hated. And I could see why in many ways. At the time when I was there in the 70s, I felt similarly to you. I didn't feel that democracy was inevitable, maybe, but I did feel that Korea was open to the world, that the desire for democracy was real, and that they hadn't put it off forever, that it was still on their agenda, and that it would probably be achieved at some time. And it was achieved at some time, although I couldn't have told you when. So that's a similar point of view. On Pak's Japanese legacy, I don't think of that as distinctive of Pak. After all, every educated person of his age was educated in the Japanese language. Many of them read Japanese better than they read Korean because, Korean hadn't been used for that many purposes during the colonial period. And so, yeah, Japanese was their window on the world. There's no question about it. But I don't think that was unique to Pak. I don't think it was, Pak went to the Japanese military academy in Manchuria, and therefore he took Japanese models. I think the entire Korean intelligentsia did exactly that because that's what they knew. And Alice Amsden, the economist, has made a very interesting observation. She thinks that all the U.S. PhDs in economics has ruined the economics profession in South Korea, because the PhDs in economics from Japan believed in development, government action, and all of the things that got Korea off the ground. And now they're all neoclassical, American-trained economists and think, just get the prices right and everything else will take care of itself. And so, that's not all bad. So I guess, did I answer your questions?
Please state your name before your question.
My name is Marek, a member of Korea Society. I have a certain relationship to Pak because I grew up in Poland in the 70s.
Uh-huh.
We are very well aware of him, communist country. And we were also aware, because of the communist propaganda, what did he do wrong.
Mm-hmm.
But most of thoughtful people in Poland were pretty much wishing to be under Park boot instead of him. That's just the aside. Park definitely was a visionary. Maybe you could address shortly what was his background to create such a visionary in that particular direction. He was a military man. I understand that's why he was so fixated on the hardware. Mm-hmm. And the heavy industries. If he would have been economist, he would be more interested in finances, I suppose.
Yeah.
Now, I would also address your comment here about him undercutting himself by creating industrialization. I think he created the working class, and through that he created a background for more of the communist, insidious communist propaganda, which always flew from Soviet Union, China, and North Korea. And the second question, which comes up here from me, is how much you are aware, or Koreans are aware, about the insidiousness of this communist subversion, which was much greater than anybody who grew up outside of a communist system can appreciate.
I think you should read my colleague Nam Hwa-suk's new book on the labor movement, because she's kind of a revisionist. She went through very voluminous labor records of a shipbuilding union in Busan, and her idea, which seemed pretty convincing because her empirical work is very detailed, is that in fact democratic unionism was established in South Korea in the 1950s, and that communist influence in the labor movement really wasn't that important after the early 50s. And that they actually, she has the minutes of meetings, and they were following Robert's Rules of Order. How Robert's Rules of Order got to the labor movement in South Korea in the 1950s. She wasn't able to solve that problem, but it's a very interesting question. How did this democratic procedure get to the labor movement when we know that the pre-war labor movement was very left-wing, and that in the 1940s it was very left-wing? But then, the labor movement was purged in the late 40s and early 50s, and they developed this democratic unionism. And her view is that the existing democratic unionism was suppressed in 1969 by President Park, and that the violence in the labor movement was actually the result of the suppressing of an already existent democratic labor movement. One could make an argument that one of the problems of the Yushin industrialization was and this wasn't so much under Park, this is something that really happened under Chun Doo-hwan, who was his successor, was that they maintained the cheap labor policy too long. And they maintained it through political suppression of the labor movement. And the consequence of that was that industry had no incentive to introduce labor-saving new technology because labor was so cheap. And then when democratization came in 1987, it came very suddenly. And for 3 years, there were strikes, and there was 50% real increase in wages to back that up. Now, that started the consumer economy before democratization, you didn't really have much of a consumer economy. The domestic market in South Korea wasn't really big enough to support a consumer economy. So that's why they had to export everything, because the domestic economy was so small. And so one could make an argument, I'm not an economist, but I'm kind of thinking my way through this. One could make an argument that if they had gradually allowed wages to rise over a 15 to 20-year period, rather than have this sudden rise in wages, that they could actually have introduced labor saving technology and increased their technological base at a gradual way that would have made it easier to adapt to the globalization, which they had such a hard time with later on.
How about Park's background?
You know, I'm not a,
Look at him as a visionary like that.
you know, I think his vision was widespread. What I see that Pak had uniquely was his ability to implement it, to administer it in an effective way without corruption. But I think the vision that he had was very widespread amongst Korean intelligentsia at that time. I mean, you read stuff and everybody says, a real economy, if we had a real economy, we'd have a steel industry and we'd have a shipbuilding industry and we'd have this and we'd have that. So people were already thinking in that way. You can go back to the 1920s. People are always saying we've got to develop an industrial economy. And how do we do it? Now, Japan was, of course, an important inspiration, because, you know, this government-led export economy was pioneered by Japan. And Korea was the next country to do that. And so I think the Japanese awareness of the Japanese example was important. But it's also important to note that the Koreans didn't do it exactly the same way that the Japanese did either. That the Japanese were able to amass their own capital through domestic savings, whereas the Koreans borrowed abroad. The Japanese were able to test their new industries on their domestic market, which was much, much larger than South Korea's market, both because Japan is a bigger country, but also because the standard of living in Japan was much higher than South Korea. So they, you know, marketed their little transistor radios to themselves until they were competitive, and then they exported. Whereas Korea had to export from day one. They didn't have time. Their domestic market wasn't big enough to practice on. They had to export to the world market immediately, which is why they used subsidies, cheap capital, and other mechanisms, which they made up themselves. They didn't learn from the Japanese. So on the one hand, the Japanese example was very, very important, but it isn't the only thing. And I think the desire for industrialization was just so widespread and so widely shared amongst the intelligentsia that the main thing that Pak had was the administrative ability to bring it about. Leadership, he definitely had leadership qualities. Now, I'm not an expert on his biography. You should get Carter Eckert or someone like that here for that. He came from a poor family. He went through the educational system, became a school teacher. And it was only after he'd been a school teacher for a while that he went to the military academy. And you can understand why a person of a poor, maybe what we would call lower middle class background, would find a military academy an attractive way of moving ahead. But he also seems to have been a nationalist. And a lot of the people who took advantage of opportunities available to them during the colonial period, almost all of the opportunities to be upwardly mobile during the colonial period involved collaboration with the Japanese in some way or another. They made sure of that. So he went through the military as a poor son of the soil might very well. And I'm sure that gave him a particular point of view. But the vision for having a developed industrial Korea, I think, was really widespread.
So he just channeled it.
He channeled it, yeah. I mean, he did definitely have leadership qualities. There's no question about that.
Hi, I'm John Koch.
Hi.
I'd just like to refocus the discussion on U.S.-Korean relations during the Park period, which were rocky at best. I did my military service during the time. I was wondering if you would agree with the thesis that the U.S. more or less had to put up with Park, whereas Park was able to play the U.S. to advantage, considering the following factors. We had a series of incidents, the Blue House raid, the Pueblo, and the infiltration, step up in infiltration, which Pak played to advantage in terms of eliciting greater military aid. In terms of the economy, I think, and my understanding is that Pak was running ahead of USOM, the U.S. Operations Mission, in terms of his ambition for the kinds of basic industries you described. And in making a contribution, a substantial contribution to the effort in Vietnam and the memorandum that grew out of that, the Brown Memorandum and so forth, Pak was able to leverage his goals by basically providing manpower that was sorely needed. So how would you say he played his hand brilliantly in terms of the situation he was faced with, whereas if you read the American diplomatic documents during the period, there's continued frustration, you know, from the Kennedy to the Johnson to the Nixon to the Carter administrations with Park and his successors. So how would you assess that in terms of his legacy, dealing with the, you know, his major power benefactor? Did he come out?
You
How
know,
well did he play his hand?
the analogy that comes to mind on that is the relationship between Korea and the U.S. is kind of like a marriage. And there's a lot of give and take, and each side thinks they're getting the worst end, but in fact, it may not be that way. If you look at it more objectively, I mean, there was a lot of frustration on the Korean side as well. If you looked at the Korean documents, you'd find a lot of frustration there too. So I'm not sure the frustration on the U.S. side is unique. As I analyze it, I would say that in the early years of the Pak administration, Pak was quite dependent upon the United States. The reason he took off his uniform and ran as a civilian president in 1963 was because of U.S. pressure that was put on him. And the U.S. provided a third or half of the South Korean budget in the early 60s. Now, with economic growth, by 1972, during the Yushin period, that wasn't true anymore. U.S. was providing, I don't know, 5 or 10% of the South Korean budget. Maybe we'd stopped, I forget exactly when economic aid stopped. So our leverage went down as the successful industrialization of the Pak regime took place. So in 1972, when Pak did his kind of in-house coup, we had a lot less leverage than we had in 1963 or 1962 or 1961. And then it was, yeah, we did have to accept Pak in 1972. But earlier on, we had a lot of leverage. So it depends upon exactly what period you're talking about. Now, if you're talking about AID and things like that, it's true that South Koreans had a really different view of how to industrialize than the U.S. did. In many ways, they were right and we were wrong, I think. The one thing that they really got, and who's the guy? I'm trying to remember the name. Who wrote Stages of Economic Growth? Yeah, Walt Rustow. Yeah. I mean, he was on every other flight to Korea during this time advising the South Korean government, and he thought a lot of the South Koreans. And the one piece of advice that they did take, that they didn't really want to take, was export-oriented industrialization. When Pak took power in 1961, 62, 63, he believed in autarky. He thought he was going to create this independent economy. He wasn't interested in exports, and it was the U.S. economic advisors that actually convinced him to do an export-led economy in the early 60s. So he actually did an about-face on that due to U.S. advisors. Now, there are other things that they ignored. The U.S. didn't think a steel industry would be viable in South Korea, and that's one of the reasons they went to Japan to get the technology and the capital, and POSCO proved that it was viable. So we weren't right on every issue either. So I think there was a lot of give and take. I don't think, they didn't play us like a violin. We didn't play them like a flute either. There was a lot of, uh, just a lot of give and take. Yeah.
I wonder if you could address a little bit more about the park nostalgia now.
The what?
The nostalgia for park nowadays. I mean, I recently read a comment that he was more popular than King Sejong and Admiral Yi, and I was so stunned at this. I even asked some South Koreans that I knew about whether that was true, or who was popular, and they agreed. Yeah, Park is definitely better than King Sejong, and although they did caveat that it's mainly because of the economic advancement, but that he
Yeah.
was better than King Sejong and Admiral Yi, and I was wondering if you could talk a while.
It sounds like your data is more recent than mine on that issue, so I'm not sure I have any update to it. The view you get of POC really depends upon who you talk to, what their age is, and so forth. And I think people, they were in their 60s and 70s pretty much think POC's the greatest thing. The 386 generation, which are people kind of in their 50s, tend to be anti-PARC more because were the ones fighting for democracy in the 80s. And the younger people, they know the effect and they don't really know about the turmoil. So it wouldn't surprise me if they thought, yeah. Yeah, the people in their 20s and 30s, they have surprising attitudes. They're not worried about unification. There are a lot of things that they say they're pretty shocking to us old folks.
Do we have one last question?
Thank you very much for your thought-provoking presentation. I have just two comments about your presentation. You mentioned urbanization, but I'd rather call it kind of growing number of middle-class people. Park Chung-hee's government's economic development has produced. I'd rather middle class, growing number of middle class is more accurate term to describe in 1970s. And second position is that you said that there are lots of investment into heavy industry. And I think you missed one thing. The lots of investment into heavy industry has some side effects. So especially with Mr. Shin-yeon coming, where that government under Park Chung-hee tried to stabilize the economy. And third one is that you said that Kim Jong-pil is son-in-law of Park Chung-hee, but I don't know whether it's correct or not, but Kim Jong-pil got married to Park Chung-hee's niece, not his
Right,
daughter.
yeah. So on your third question, your revision is correct. So I'll just accept it. Remind me of your first other two questions. So, what? Oh, social stratification is a really, really complicated topic. I would say that under Pak himself, the middle class didn't really develop very much. People were relatively equal. That was mostly due to the land reform, which was done in the 1950s. If you look at Gini coefficients in those days, they were quite low, but most of it had to do with rural equality rather than urban equality. And I'm not sure that I would say that in those days the urban middle class was very large or even had much of a standard of living. To me, the middle class really takes off in the 1990s, along with the development of the consumer economy. When wages rose and, what we'll call the industrial aristocrats, the workers in the high-tech, very well-capitalized industries, started getting pay that allowed them to, buy refrigerators and washing machines and things like that, and kind of participate in the consumer economy. So, what? And real estate, yeah. Well, during the Pak regime, real estate was deprived of capital, and this was deliberate because they wanted to save capital for industrial development. So housing conditions in urban areas were actually abysmal in the 60s and 70s. There were 2 and 3 people to a house. Whole families lived in one room, particularly in the working class. And again, It was actually housing began to boom in the 1980s under the Chun Doo-hwan regime because he had to kind of loosen up the consumer economy because unlike Pak, Pak had a lot of respect. He was personally not corrupt, although some of his colleagues were corrupt, but he himself was not particularly. But under his successor, Chun Doo-hwan was quite corrupt. His wife used to be called the Big Hand because, you know, and so there's not a lot of nostalgia for Chun Doo-hwan, even though the economy developed fairly well during this period. And so he had to kind of loosen restraints on consumption during the 1980s. And one of the loosening things he did was allow more capital into housing, so that this is when the large, multi-story apartment blocks started to be built in large numbers. And this was a result of that policy change. But I don't really see much of a middle class in the 60s and 70s.
Thank you.
Thank you for being such an attentive and interesting audience.